There is a generation of people who remember a different America. An America where an average person could buy a house, send their kids to college, and retire with dignity, working at the same company for 30 years. An America where the future felt not like a threat, but like a promise. Where technology meant progress, not anxiety. Where the phrase American dream did not sound like bitter irony. That America existed. It was not perfect, but it was real. And it disappeared so gradually that most people never noticed the moment when it was gone. If you want to understand what happened to America, you need to go back to 2 decades that now seem almost mythical, the 80s and the 90s. This was a time when America did not just dominate the world, it defined what the world would be. When American ideas, American goods, American culture, and American confidence spread across the planet with such force that it seemed like this would last forever. But here is the paradox. It was precisely during these golden decades that the seeds of what we lost were planted. Every decision that seemed like a triumph carried a hidden cost. Every victory contained the kernel of future defeat. This is not a story about villains and conspiracies. This is a story about how the best intentions, multiplied by human nature and time, transform into consequences no one foresaw. In January 1981, when Ronald Reagan delivered his inaugural address, America was in a depression, not just economic, psychological. Behind them were Vietnam, Watergate, the oil crisis, the Iranian hostages, inflation at 14%, gas lines, a feeling that the country was moving in the wrong direction and no one knew how to stop it. Reagan offered something revolutionary for that moment, optimism, not naive, not foolish, but confident. He looked into the camera with his calm eyes and told Americans what they desperately wanted to hear. The problem is not you. The problem is not America. The problem is that the government has become too big, too slow, too heavy a burden on those who want to work and create. Government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem. That phrase became the manifesto of an era, and it contained a grain of truth that made it so powerful. What happened next, Americans still call simply Reaganomics, tax cuts, deregulation, a belief that if you untied the hands of business, wealth would flow from the top down to everyone else. And in the 80s, it actually worked, at least it seemed to. The stock market began an ascent that would last nearly 2 decades. Inflation dropped from 14% to 4%. Unemployment fell. New companies sprang up like mushrooms after rain. In Silicon Valley, which was then just a suburb of San Francisco with fruit orchards, young people in garages were creating the future. Steve Jobs returned to Apple. Microsoft went public. The first personal computers appeared in the homes of ordinary Americans. This was a time when a mid-level engineer at a tech company could earn enough in a few years to buy a house in a good neighborhood. When a factory worker with a union wage belonged to the middle class, the real middle class, not what we call it today. The 80s created a particular culture, a culture of unapologetic ambition. Hollywood produced films where heroes won, where America won, where good triumphed not in a metaphorical, but in a literal sense. Rocky beat the Soviet boxer. Tom Cruise flew fighter jets. Michael J. Fox traveled through time in a car created by American genius. Music was loud and confident. Fashion was bright and excessive. Even hairstyles were big, as if people wanted to occupy as much space in the world as possible. The word yuppie, young urban professional, entered the language. Young professionals in expensive suits, with new credit cards, with faith that tomorrow would be better than today. And here's what is important to understand. This faith was not an illusion. For most of these people, tomorrow really was better. And then something happened that no one expected to see in their lifetime. The Berlin Wall fell, not from a military strike or from the weight of its own meaninglessness. People simply began dismantling it, and no one stopped them. The Soviet Union, the empire that for half a century had been the main adversary, the main fear, the main justification for trillions of dollars in military spending, this empire crumbled in just a few years. America did not just win, it was left alone at the top of the world. Francis Fukuyama wrote an article titled The End of History. The idea was simple. Liberal democracy and market economy had won definitively. There were no other viable alternatives left. The future was determined, and it was American. The article did not seem arrogant. It seemed obvious. Bill Clinton came to the White House in 1993, and he was something entirely new. The first president born after World War II, the first president of the baby boomer generation. He played saxophone on TV shows. He admitted to trying marijuana, but did not inhale. He was young, charismatic, and his wife was smarter than most of his advisors, and everyone knew it. After 12 years of Republicans, Clinton represented a different America. Not one looking back at a glorious past, but one looking forward to an even more glorious future. And the future, it seemed, agreed. The 90s became the decade when everything that could grow grew. The stock market broke all records. then broke them again, then again. The Dow Jones Index, which was around 2,500 at the beginning of the decade, exceeded 11,000 by its end. Anyone with a retirement account felt like an investment genius. Unemployment fell below 4%, a level economists considered theoretically impossible without inflation. Inflation stayed low, and something happened that had not happened in decades. The federal budget showed a surplus. America did not just stop increasing its debt, it began paying it down. Analysts seriously discussed what would happen when the national debt was fully repaid. Imagine, people worried that there would be too little debt. But the main thing that happened in the 90s could not be measured in money. The internet emerged from laboratories and military networks into the homes of ordinary people. And this changed everything. At first it was strange and incomprehensible. Modems beeped and hissed, connecting at speeds that today would seem like torture. Web pages looked like school projects. No one knew exactly what it was for. And then people began to understand. Email meant you could instantly reach anyone in the world, for free. Websites meant anyone could publish anything for the entire planet. Search engines meant all of humanity's information was now accessible to everyone. Amazon started as an online bookstore. Google was a research project by 2 graduate students. Young people in t-shirts founded companies that within a few years were worth billions. The internet was an American invention, built on American technology, operating by American rules, and the whole world connected to it on American terms. In the 90s, America achieved a level of dominance the world had not seen since the Roman Empire. Military superiority was absolute. Economic, unquestionable. Cultural, all-pervading. American movies were watched everywhere. American music was listened to everywhere. American jeans were worn everywhere. American English was learned everywhere. The word globalization entered common usage, and it essentially meant Americanization. The world was becoming flat, as Thomas Friedman would later write. And on that flat world, the American flag was visible everywhere. When international crises occurred in Bosnia and Kosovo and the Persian Gulf, the world looked to Washington, not because it was obligated to, because there was no one else to look to. It is hard to convey in words what that optimism was like. People believed, seriously, sincerely believed, that technology would solve all problems, that the economy would grow forever, that the new generation would live better than the previous one, as had always been true in American history, that democracy and the free market had won forever. Time magazine called the 90s America's decade. This was not boasting. It was a statement of fact. The year 2000 was greeted with a feeling that the 21st century would be America's century, that the best was yet to come, that the 80s and 90s were only the beginning. Now we need to stop and look at this shining picture from a different angle, because everything I described is true, but it is not the whole truth. And in what remained off camera, the future we received was hiding. In the 80s and 90s, things were happening that seemed like minor technical details at the time, boring paragraphs in economic reports, trends that experts noted but that worried no one while the sun was shining and the market was rising. These things accumulated quietly, like a debt that future generations would have to repay. In 1980, the CEO of a major company earned, on average, 42 times more than an ordinary worker. By 2000, 525 times more. That is not a typo. The ratio changed more than 12-fold in 20 years. But almost no one noticed. Because the economy was growing. Because the stock market was lifting all boats. Because even if the rich were getting richer faster, the middle class was also getting richer. Or at least it seemed so. In reality, something else was happening. The middle class was increasingly maintaining its standard of living not through income, but through debt. Credit cards became the norm. Second mortgages became the norm. 2 working parents in a family became not a choice, but a necessity. Wealth was being created. But it was being distributed ever more unequally. And this process, once started, did not stop. In the 80s and 90s, American companies discovered a simple truth. Workers in other countries cost less. First, it was simple manufacturing. Textiles, toys, electronics. Then more complex, auto parts, machine tools. Then even more complex. For economists, this was a natural process. Comparative advantages, efficient resource allocation. America would produce ideas and technology. Other countries would produce physical goods. For the economy as a whole, it worked. GDP grew, corporate profits grew, consumer prices fell. For specific people, it meant something else. Cities like Detroit, Cleveland, Pittsburgh began losing population. Factories closed, unions weakened. Jobs that allowed a person without a college degree to raise a family in their own home disappeared. They were replaced by other jobs, in service, in retail, but these jobs paid less, offered less stability, promised less future. Economists called this structural transformation. Politicians promised retraining. But a person who had worked at a steel mill for 20 years could not simply become a programmer. In the 80s, something began that would later be called financialization. In simple terms, more and more money and talent flowed from producing real things to manipulating financial instruments. Wall Street had always been an important part of the American economy, but in the 80s and 90s, it became dominant. The best graduates of the best universities no longer wanted to build bridges or heal people. They wanted to join investment banks. Money could be made from money. Why produce anything material? The financial sector grew from 15% of corporate profits in 1980 to 40% by the end of the 90s. Banks became too big to fail. Complex financial instruments that no one understood spread through the system. This created wealth, enormous wealth. But this wealth was fragile, built on credit, on trust, on mathematical models that worked until they did not. Something changed in the culture too. The 80s and 90s taught Americans that growth is normal, that housing prices go up, that stocks go up, that tomorrow will be more than today. This created a mentality that was hard to notice from the inside, an orientation towards short-term results. Companies began thinking in quarterly reports, not decade-long plans. Politicians, in election cycles, not historical consequences. People, about the next purchase, not long-term stability. Savings fell, consumption grew, credit replaced accumulation. This was invisible because the system could sustain it, while it could. Here is what is important to understand. There was no moment when America fell from the top. There was no event after which everything changed. Even September 11th, for all its trauma, was not a turning point. Even the 2008 financial crisis, for all its destruction, was a symptom, not a cause. America did not fall. It slid, slowly, down a slope that seemed gentle until you looked back. By the 2000s, what was called the middle class began to disappear. Not physically, statistically. The middle class was splitting. Some rose toward the upper middle. Some, a much larger portion, descended. Wages stagnated. Prices for housing, education, healthcare rose faster than inflation. The younger generation discovered it could not afford what their parents took for granted. A house in the suburbs, one working parent. Retirement at 65, confidence in tomorrow. All of this transformed from a standard of living into a privilege. Americans did not immediately notice because there was credit. Cannot buy a house on your salary. There is a mortgage. Cannot pay for college. There's a student loan. Cannot make ends meet this month. There's a credit card. The standard of living was maintained. Consumption grew. But beneath the surface, families were going deeper and deeper into debt. Total American household debt grew from $2 trillion in 1980 to $14 trillion by 2008. This was unsustainable. Everyone knew it. No one knew when it would stop. In 2008, it stopped. And then there was China. In the 80s and 90s, China was a poor developing country where American companies moved production to save on labor. By the 2000s, China became something else. The second largest economy in the world. The largest manufacturer. The largest creditor of the American government. A country that built high-speed trains while American infrastructure crumbled. America was still number one, but the gap was shrinking. Every year. Unstoppably. But perhaps the biggest loss was invisible. Americans lost faith, not in God, in the system, in institutions, in the future. Polls showed trust in government, in corporations, in media, in the church, in each other, had been falling decade after decade. People no longer believed the system worked for them, that the rules were fair, that hard work would be rewarded, that their children would live better. The optimism that defined the 80s and 90s evaporated. In its place came cynicism, anxiety, anger. When people talk about the best America, they usually mean specific things. Affordable housing, stable jobs, economic growth, world leadership. All of this is real. All of it is measurable. All of it was indeed lost to one degree or another. But I think the main loss was something else. America lost its story about itself. In the 80s and 90s, there existed a narrative that almost everyone believed. A story about a country that was constantly getting better, where every generation lived better than the previous one, where problems were solved because Americans knew how to solve problems, where the future was not a threat, but an invitation. This story was not entirely accurate. It ignored those whom progress left behind. It hid contradictions under a carpet of optimism. It promised more than it could deliver. But it worked. It gave people a common purpose, a common identity, a common direction. Today, that story no longer exists. America is divided into tribes, each with its own version of the past and its own vision of the future. A common narrative does not exist. A common purpose does not exist. And this, perhaps, is the greatest loss of all. Not the money, not the power, not the influence. The belief that we are all in this together, and that together we are moving towards something better. That belief was the heart of the America we lost, And without it, everything else, economy, politics, culture, becomes just a struggle for survival. Can this faith be restored? Can a new story be written that unites instead of divides? I do not know. No one knows. But I do know that understanding what we lost is the first step toward understanding what we need to find.